So what Darwin's idea was that if you have new traits appearing, and some of those traits are going to give individuals a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a particular environment, they will leave more offspring. And then in the next generation, you will have more individuals with that particular trait. And we can call this as well differential survival. So some individuals survive, some individuals do not survive, some produce more offspring in the next generation, some produce fewer or zero offspring in the next generation. And that's what's going to change species and populations generation after generation. It's not individuals that are changing, it's the population and which traits we see in a particular population that's going to change. And this is different from what others who thought evolution was occurring thought. So Lamarck, who we'll talk about, he thought individuals evolved and adapted to the environment. And Darwin said, no, new traits appear. New traits may or may not be adaptations. If they are good adaptations and they allow that individual to survive and reproduce, then the next generation there will be more of that particular trait, more individuals carrying that particular trait. So an adaptation is environment specific. Natural selection cannot force an adaptation to appear just because it's needed. So traits appear. We now know that's due to random mutations. So random mutations are always occurring. Every generation, mutations are occurring. And occasionally, a mutation occurs that increases an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. Those will be the ones that will be passed on. And this can cause closely related organisms to have spectacularly different adaptations. So in these two photos are two mantids. So mantids are generally fairly large insects that are ambush predators. They're carnivorous. They eat other insects, but they can also eat small birds and small mammals, even like mice. So I don't know if you can even see this one here very well. So this is a mantid from Malaysia that's adapted for living on orchids. And there's a leg, here's an eye, here's the other eye, there's the abdomen, hind legs here. And it's a very unusual color for an insect. Most mantids are some version of green, like greenish, brownish colored. And how would this evolve by natural selection? So imagine the ancestors of this mantid, who were greenish and greenish to brownish like most mantids are, living on orchids, lying in wait for insects to come along, and any one that had just a tiny bit of pinkish or purplish coloration because of a new mutation would be more successful and would leave more offspring. And as new mutations occurred, any mutation that created a more camouflaged individual, that individual would be more successful and its trait would be passed on. So here's another mantid. This one lives in a dry tropical forest in Borneo, and it looks very much like a leaf. So again, we have insects that are ambush predators, which means they don't chase anything. They sit and wait for things to get close enough for them to grab. So the more they kind of blend into the surroundings, the more likely they're going to be successful. So natural selection, again, doesn't create a trait because it's needed. The trait has to appear randomly. So there's two parts to evolution. The random part is mutation. Mutations are completely random. They have no relationship to what might be needed by a particular change in environment. And then we have natural selection. And natural selection is not random. Natural selection is based on what the local environment has. So a trait that's adaptive and will be selected for in a particular environment may be selected against in another environment. It may be a disadvantage in another environment. So mutations are, when we say mutation, the definition of mutation has changed since the discovery of DNA and the structure of DNA. This is what we get for a DNA sequence here, this long string of A, C's, G's, and T's. That's what our DNA is. Each letter stands for a nucleotide. And when DNA replicates every time a cell divides, that replication is not perfect. A mutation, the old definition of a mutation, was anything we could see in the organism's phenotype. So there had to be some kind of a visible change in the organism for that to be called a mutation. And now we say a mutation is any change to the DNA. So any change to even one of these letters in a particular individual that would be passed on to the next generation, we would call that a mutation. So a mutation may not affect the phenotype of the organism. So the phenotype, we'll hear about this later in genetics. The phenotype is what we see or what we can measure in an organism. So your phenotype includes how tall you are, how fast you can run, what is your blood pressure, what is your skin color. Those are all part of your phenotype. And it's determined by which alleles you have, which versions of a gene you have. So many mutations, though, are not going to affect that. Most of our genome is, in fact, not genes. There's a lot of DNA that's, if it's changed by a letter or two, it's not going to affect the phenotype. In that case, natural selection cannot act on it. Natural selection does not act directly on the DNA. Instead, natural selection acts on traits that result from the DNA. So there could be many mutations that occur. None of them change the phenotype, so therefore natural selection is not going to act on them. Or we could have just a single letter change, and it has a drastic effect on the phenotype, and so natural selection is going to act on that particular trait. Darwin waited quite a long time to publish his first manuscript. After the Voyage of the Beagle, within a couple of years, he had a completed manuscript, but then he sat on it and didn't publish it. Probably he was afraid of public criticism. One of the things that he realized about his hypothesis was that it was completely naturalistic. His hypothesis for evolution, for species changing over time, for the origin of life, for the evolution of humans didn't require a deity and was completely natural and scientific, and he knew that would upset people. So he didn't publish. However, he was very worried that he might die unexpectedly and his work would be lost. So he did put money aside with a friend, 50 pounds, I believe it was, and his unpublished manuscript, just in case he might unexpectedly die. His work would get published anyway. So Alfred Russel Wallace, who was younger, he was off in the Pacific studying island bird species, and he especially liked birds of paradise, and he discovered many new species for science. He came up with the same idea of populations changing generation by generation by who survives to reproduce and who doesn't. And he started to write to some scientists about that, and one of them was familiar with Darwin's idea and said, you know, Wallace, you should write to Darwin, write to Charles Darwin and tell him your idea. And so he did. And Darwin, told him, well, it's time for me to publish then. Let's publish our papers together. So they presented their papers at the same time, and that was pretty generous of Darwin. He could have gotten Wallace's letter and then published his paper and not given Wallace the same credit, but he didn't do that. He realized the importance of another person independently coming up with the same idea. Wallace doesn't get as much credit, however, because his interests didn't range as widely as Darwin. Wallace didn't talk about the origin of life. Wallace didn't talk about the evolution of man, so he doesn't get as much credit. It was Darwin's contention that humans evolved from an ape ancestor that got the most criticism. This image here, this is from a newspaper of the time. One of the common criticisms is people said, well, maybe Darwin is related to a monkey, but, the rest of us aren't. So that was probably the most controversial thing. Just like when Carl Linnaeus, 100 years before, had said when he started categorizing all living things and said, we needed 2-species naming system, and he came up with the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species system. When he gave our species a name and said that humans were primates, that also upset a lot of people at the time, because many people like to think that humans aren't animals and we are somehow separate and above, and anybody who says differently gets criticized. So let's look at Lamarck for a second. So Lamarck was the generation before Darwin. He was the French aristocrat he did science as a hobby, although he didn't do experiments like we think of today. He studied and he wrote. And he also thought that species changed over time, although he thought individuals evolved, because of course they didn't know about DNA or how we get from a DNA to phenotype. They didn't know any of that then. And his idea actually kind of followed a common folk idea, which was that things that happen to you during your lifetime could be inherited. It was a common folk belief that accidents and injuries that happen during your lifetime, that those injuries could possibly be passed on to offspring. So a woman who had a horrible burn scar, for example, people thought it was more likely that she would have a child with some kind of disfigurement later in life. If especially a woman had lost a hand or an arm in some kind of a farming accident, people thought it would be more likely that she would give birth to a baby that was missing an arm. That was a common folk belief because, of course, they didn't understand heredity. And so Lamarck put that into more formal terms. He kind of had the same idea. His proposals have been tested experimentally, and they didn't hold up. One of the examples that Lamarck used was a blacksmith. So blacksmiths were everywhere. If you needed anything made out of metal, in Lamarck's lifetime, you pretty much had to go to a blacksmith and have them specially make it for you. If you needed something for a gate or handles or things for your house, you went to a blacksmith and they made it for you. And he noticed that blacksmiths were very muscular, and also sons of blacksmiths were more muscular than their age-same peers. And so his hypothesis was, well, blacksmiths work very hard, they build up their muscles, and then when they have children, their sons also are going to have bigger muscles. Now, the obvious other explanation that Lamarck didn't think of, which probably you've already thought of, is that sons of blacksmiths started working in the blacksmith shop probably as soon as they could carry wood for the fire at age 4 or 5, and so they worked very hard all their life. I don't think this would have occurred to Lamarck as somebody who was very wealthy, never worked as a child. The idea of children doing heavy physical labor probably didn't occur to him, and the idea that they inherited their big muscles from their father probably made more sense to him. But he did think that evolution occurred. So we have to separate the idea that biological evolution occurred from the mechanism that's proposed. So at that time, this was a different proposed mechanism. One of the popular ways that scientists like to use to explain evolution is by the evolution of really weird traits. So giraffes are weird. They have really long necks and also very long legs, and a number of specialized adaptations internally that go along with that. But they're essentially antelope-like animals. Their ancestors, if you go back far enough, did not have extra long legs and necks. And Lamarck's explanation of inheritance of acquired traits would be that we have our population of proto-giraffes a few million years ago, and each proto-giraffe, they're browsing animals, they eat leaves, not grass, were stretching their necks out trying to reach the highest leaves on the trees, and each individual would stretch their neck out just a tiny bit every generation, and then when they would reproduce, their offspring would be born with slightly longer necks, and then they again would stretch out their necks, and generation after generation you end up with these super long necks. So what's the difference between that and Darwin's theory? So Darwin said, okay, in our ancestral proto-giraffe population, they're not all the same. Some have slightly longer necks than others. Some have slightly longer legs. When there's a drought and food is scarce, only the tallest giraffes are going to be able to reach food and survive. The rest are going to die and are not going to reproduce, or are going to have fewer offspring. And then they reproduce, and when you have the longest necked individuals are the only ones that reproduce, the next generation is going to have longer necks. And you do that for 1 million years. Every time there's a drought, the ones that are the tallest survive and reproduce. You get a species now that has extremely long necks and legs. Now, a slight twist to this has been introduced recently, and this is a good example of how new data can make us rethink the details of some of these things. Someone finally did some detailed observations of giraffes in the wild. I can't think of the guy's name right now, but he observed giraffes in the wild for about 5 years. He used cameras, he photographed them and filmed them over long periods of time, which surprisingly no one had ever done for wild giraffes. And what he discovered was that male giraffes fight, and they often fight to the death. And this was not known, and what he discovered was that the tallest male almost always wins. So he proposed that instead of this browsing in the trees explanation for giraffes' extremely long necks, then instead it's due to male giraffes fighting, and that this is all sexual selection, that if you have only the longest necked males, only the tallest individuals are going to win a fight. Those individuals are the ones who are going to reproduce, and the females have long necks just because genetically you're not going to be able to separate the traits of males and females like that. And other biologists were quick to say, you know, it could absolutely be both of those things. He did not observe the giraffes during a drought year, so we don't really know what would happen if food was truly scarce. And only the tallest giraffes could reach leaves on the top of the trees. That didn't occur in the time he was observing the giraffe. So interesting new tidbit of information, but it's still, even though it's different than this explanation, it still is, there's variation, and we have differential survival. New data has continued to be added to the theory of evolution. So when Darwin first described it, we didn't know about DNA. The whole field of genetics didn't even exist at that time. And since then, besides genetics and a lot more information about heredity, we now know DNA is the hereditary molecule. We have discovered whole new types of organisms like archaea, which were thought to be the same as bacteria before. They were all just prokaryotes. All these things have continued to add to evolutionary theory. And there are some details that are different, but Darwin's basic framework of evolution by random variation and then natural selection is still the basis for evolutionary theory. So back to Darwin's finches. So why does this happen? And not just on the Galapagos, but on islands all over the world, which is how Wallace ended up with the same idea, because he was also studying island species. So the Galapagos are relatively young islands, only a few million years old. They're volcanic, and they're quite far from the closest mainland, which is Ecuador. So that means that at first, the only species that would be found there would be ones that made it there across a large span of hundreds of miles of open ocean. And very few species would be able to do that. So there are fewer plants that would have made it, fewer animals that would have made it. So there were no mammals initially on the Galapagos, and only a subset of the bird species that are found on the mainland. And the same thing happens with plants and insects as well, although we spend a lot less time talking about those. So what we call this, when we have a few or even one colonizing species that radiates into many species, that's called an adaptive radiation, because there are open ecological niches and no animals filling those niches like large seed-eating birds or grub-eating specialists. And birds evolved to fill those open niches because there's food available, and particular individuals that had slightly larger beaks that could eat a food source that other members of their species couldn't eat would have survived and produced more offspring. So this is even though it's kind of flattened, this is a tree of relatedness of all of these different Galapagos finches by DNA analysis, because they're all so similar. It's very difficult to tell which species are more related to which just based on morphology or their shapes of their bodies and beaks. When islands have particular species like this that are found nowhere else, we call that an endemic species. The Hawaiian Islands as well have endemic species. The Hawaiian Islands are in some ways even more isolated than the Galapagos, being out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They don't have a finch adaptive radiation. Finches didn't make it there. Instead, a species from Asia, honey creepers, made it to the Hawaiian Islands, and there was an adaptive radiation of honey creepers there. And for insects, the Hawaiian Islands had a huge adaptive radiation of fruit flies. Scientists from all over the world go to Hawaii just to study the fruit flies, because there are species of fruit flies there, hundreds of them, found nowhere else. There, in fact, are more species of fruit flies there than anywhere else in the world, because other insects simply didn't make it there. And the fruit flies had an adaptive radiation to fill the niches. So Hawaii doesn't have any mosquitoes, as they will proudly tell you, but they do have blood-sucking fruit flies. So Wallace is most famous for his discovery in the Pacific. So here we have, there's the Pacific, and here's Australia down here, and the Asian mainland up here, Borneo, Papua New Guinea over here. And what he discovered was that if you draw this line through all of these island nations here, and at the closest point, they're only 7 miles apart. So the island of Bali and the island of Lombok are only 7 miles apart. You can actually see land across the water there. And what he discovered was that on the east side of this line, birds and mammals that you find are more like birds and mammals that you find in Australia. So marsupial mammals like wallabies. And on the west side of this line, you find animals and mammals and birds that are more like what you find in Asia. And he did not know the reason why this expanse of water, that animals seem to have trouble crossing it, but we do now, and that's because of what happens during ice ages. The ice ages, the fact that they occurred hadn't been discovered yet at that time, but we now know that during an ice age, of which there have been several, most of the more of the world's water is locked up in ice at the North and the South Pole, and that causes sea level to drop dramatically. Well, during the last several ice ages, land bridges appeared between all of these islands and between all of these islands and Australia. The Wallace Line is where there is a deep ocean trench, and there was no land bridge during the ice age. So that's why it seems like species were unable to cross this. But we now call this the Wallace Line after Alfred Russel Wallace. And that's probably his most memorable contribution, as well as all the species of birds that he described and the birds of paradise that he described.